Hello and welcome to our latest Nesta Talks to event, which is our series where we have the pleasure to speak with today's most interesting thinkers on the big topics related to our missions and innovation methods. So if you're new to Nesta, we're the UK's innovation agency for social good, where we design, test and scale ideas and solutions focused on our three mission areas: a sustainable future, a healthy life and a fairer start for all. And to quickly cover some housekeeping notes, closed captions can be accessed via the LinkedIn live stream, and you can join the conversation in the comments box on the right-hand side of your screen in both LinkedIn and YouTube. And we'd really welcome any any comments or thoughts that you have, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. So just before introducing you to our guests, I'll give a quick introduction to myself, Nesta, and why we're particularly excited to have these two great minds with us today. So I'm Ollie Whittington. I'm leading democratic innovation research in Nesta's Centre for Collective Intelligence Design. And the centre is Nesta's home for researching and designing collective intelligence to tools to understand and solve some of the challenges we face in society today, often by bringing together diverse groups of people with the help of technology and data. So that's why today we're really excited to welcome two people who have helped us learn a lot about new ways of bringing people together and why reclaiming the idea of citizenship could change how we think of ourselves and each other. So without further ado, our first speaker today is Claudia Chwalisz, who leads the OECD's work on innovative citizen participation, looking at new forms of democracy beyond elections. And Claudia's work is focused on deliberative processes like citizen assemblies, which are becoming increasingly common in the UK and around the world. And while being the lead author of many of OECD's work on deliberative democracy, Claudia has also been supporting the design of many of these pioneering forms of engagement, including the Permanent Citizens Assembly in Paris and the Osborne Citizens Council. And alongside Claudia, we're really happy to have Jon Alexander. Jon is the author of his new book, Citizens, book which explores the citizen story. It's not where we see ourselves as part of a creative and capable and caring collective that is stronger than any of us individually. So prior to writing Citizens, Jon co-founded the new Citizenship Project, which is an organisation reframing the relationship between institutions and the people they work with to move beyond selling stuff to consumers and towards involving people in the decisions that affects their lives as citizens. So Jon, Claudia, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Lovely to be here.
Hello, Ollie. Thank you.
And to kick us off, Claudia, I was hoping you could introduce the concept of deliberative democracy and how it's different from the democracy that we're familiar with today.
Yeah, I think that's a good question to start with before we dive into any more detailed things. So deliberative democracy is kind of the political theory that goes back to Habermas, to Rawls, which at its heart has this notion that political decisions should be the result of fair and reasonable dialogue and debate between people who work together to actually come to a collective judgment. So these aspects of it, I think, are really different to what defines a lot of our politics today, both in terms of representative democracy as we think of it through elections, but also more participatory forms of democracy, which rely on rather mass participation, but that being less in depth and not necessarily having that collective judgment element to it.
Great, that's really useful, thank you. And Jon, could you kind of introduce the citizen story and what it's all about and how it's different from the world we experience today, if it is?
Sure. Thanks, Ollie. And when I'm not holding my book up upside down to kick off events in true style, the set of ideas I work with essentially is an argument that we're living in a moment in time when what I think of as the dominant story of the individual in society is shifting. So this is a shift at a very deep level. And what I talk about essentially is a shift from subject to consumer to citizen as the story of the individual in society, from at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, an idea that we were subjects, that the right thing for us to do was to keep our heads down and do as we were told on the basis that the God-given few know best and they'll lead us to the best outcomes for society as a whole. And then with the rise of the middle class, the Industrial Revolution, et cetera, that story fell apart under the weight of its own contradictions, just couldn't survive anymore. And out of the two world wars, we more or less consciously constructed what I call the consumer story. which says the right thing to do actually is to look out for number one, to choose the best deal for yourself from those that are offered, on the basis that individual self-interest can add up to collective interest, that by pursuing our own self-interest, that will result in the best outcomes for society as a whole. And that story collapsing in on itself, much as the subject story did before. And what's has been emerging, has always been there as an undercurrent actually throughout human history, but might take hold in this moment because we have the tools and the technologies and the scale at which to do it, is what I call the citizen story. And the citizen story says the right thing to do is to get involved, to share your ideas, energy and resources to the search for the best outcomes for society as a whole, on the basis that all of us are smarter than any of us, and that is how we will achieve those. And so that is a story that is certainly something that I think is building and growing across the world of government, and Claudia's work a major part of that, but is also taking hold across the world of business and charity and movement and community as well. So it's a deep societal phenomenon that I'm trying to name and really offer a way of seeing the moment in time we're living in, not just as one of collapse, but also as one of huge opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And
yeah,
could I also go for it?
I just wanted to actually jump in. I know this is going off our script, but connected to what Jon was just saying, I wanted to actually draw the link directly to what he was saying and this notion of deliberative democracy, because actually at its heart, to believe in deliberative democracy is to believe that all of us as citizens are equally worthy and capable of participating in our collective decision making. So, we talk about processes and institutions a lot, but actually that underpinning belief is one in citizens.
And just kind of on that interrelatedness, I guess, because it feels like to make deliberative processes more effective, maybe we need this kind of citizen story to take hold. And is it one before the other, or how do they relate as you see it?
Is that back to me? Sorry. Yeah, I jumped in early, but I think I'm not sure it's one before the other. It's like the chicken and egg question. I think we need both because we also have quite a lot of evidence which shows that by being part in a deliberative process, that in itself actually strengthens people's sense of agency, their efficacy, their belief in their ability to change things around them, to become more active in their communities outside of that, to start political and civic associations, to get more engaged in politics in their communities. And so there's that ripple effect. But at the same time, I think we need to be also working on other ways in which to strengthen society's kind of civic
I think my take on that question, for what it's worth, would be I talk a bit in the book about a theory of change, an idea of how change happens that we call social acupuncture, which is like you're into the energy is building for a new story, and it can be replaced unleashed in many different places in many different ways. And I think so to say like one deliberate, but I do think so there are many different things that can contribute to that, but I do think deliberative democracy as a sort of central method for this is essential. One of the examples I particularly love is the campaign that Mass LBP, one of the pioneers of this work, has been leading in Canada for what they call the Democratic Action Fund, which is actually for a relatively trivial amount of money in the scale of government spending would create enough citizens' assemblies in Canada every year that within a few years you'd have every citizen would either have been part of one of these things or know someone who had. And that kind of thing, it's not just because of the direct involvement and all of the consequences that Claudia has talked about, but it's also the narrative power of that. Like the relationship between citizen and state that would be encapsulated in that action. So to what you're saying, it's like it's not that deliberative democracy and the citizen, they are sort of each other in a way, and it's by doing things like assemblies, but also many other things that actually the story shifts, that the idea of self shifts.
And Claudia, just to make this a bit more real, could you introduce like the kind of process that a citizen assembly kind of goes through, and maybe one that you've been working on recently?
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point, because deliberative democracy is that broader theory, but the way in which it manifests usually is through these deliberative processes. So things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, in some places they're called planning cells or consensus conferences, but all of them have a certain number of things in common in terms of how they work. So first is that they bring together a broadly representative group of society, usually through something called a civic lottery. The technical term is sortition, which I think is kind of slightly coming back into more mainstream use today, so I am going to use it despite it being somewhat jargony. So people are chosen through sortition, but this is important because it's like a key difference to how people usually participate in other forms of more participatory or direct democracy as well. So in the first instance, there's usually a very large number of invitations that go out to people. So like 10 to 30,000 invitations will go out from a mayor or a minister or a prime minister or president in some cases, inviting people to be part of this citizens' assembly, which has a specific real kind of task and problem at its heart. So if we take the example, for example, recently in France where I am, there was the Citizens Convention on climate. So people were tasked with coming up with really concrete, specific proposals for how can France reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030, but in a way that is socially just. So keeping in consideration all of those different trade-offs, 150 people were selected through this kind of civic lottery, where first there were a lot of people who received an invitation to participate, and amongst everybody who says yes, there's then a second lottery, which ensures that the final group, though, is broadly representative of society when it comes to things like gender, age, socioeconomic status, geography, and sometimes some other criteria. So that group then has the conditions created to be able to grapple with the complexity of that issue. So they hear from experts, but they also hear from stakeholders. They hear lived experiences related to the issue, and also they listen to one another, because the fact that you've brought together this really diverse group of people allows the collective intelligence of the group actually to emerge. So there's the time for that to actually come up, for people to weigh the trade-offs, and then they have the difficult task of actually coming together to find consensus and common ground on their proposals to the public authority on this issue. And now that doesn't mean that every single person there is going to 100% agree with everything that gets proposed, but the aim is to get to that point where, at least 80% of the people in that group can say like, okay, I may not agree, but I can live with this. And so this is how we've come to see on hundreds of examples of these kinds of processes now, everyday people actually getting together and coming up with some really concrete proposals to how we could move forward on some of the most difficult problems that we're facing together as a society.
Perfect. And so I guess when we're talking about the framing of this conversation as the future of democracy, and Jon, you mentioned that citizens' assembly could be one of these acupuncture points in this shift of the citizen story. And I guess democracy is a big, messy thing. So are there any other kind of interesting acupuncture points you might think just like frames this future of democracy that we're starting to paint?
Yeah, thousands. No, look, I just to give you a couple of examples of the sort of thing I'm really interested in that surrounds this at the moment, and staying just within the frame of government. Actually, I could talk about like purpose-driven business and crowdfunding and equity crowdfunding and the renaissance of cooperatives and all of that sort of thing. But like there is that whole, and the rebirth of movements and and charity organizations reclaiming an idea of themselves as movement organizers rather than just sort of service deliverers. Like there's so much that you could go to, all of which are essentially acupuncture points. But just to stay within the frame of government and kind of expand slightly, I'm really interested, for example, in working on the concept of a citizen confidence index as a measure of success of society. Like currently we have a consumer confidence index, which is both very narrowing in terms of the story it tells us about what people's role in the flourishing of a society is, even more narrowing than GDP, which is itself much lamented. But what if we were to measure the extent to which people actually feel they have agency to shape the society that they live in, the context of their lives? And actually, I would argue that it might be there that we need to intervene rather than at the level of GDP, because if people have agency, then the evidence suggests they're happier, more flourishing, likely to be more productive, and you might get a more sort of sustainable growth sort kind of growth in a society. Like there's a valid hypothesis for that, rather than just a consumption driven growth, which is unsustainable in every sense. But from there right through to it's not just citizens' assemblies. There's open idea generation platforms. That in Reykjavik in Iceland, there's a very simple platform where anyone can propose an idea for how the city can be better. Those ideas are upvoted, downvoted, and the top ones on a regular basis are debated in a special session of the city council and get a public response. There's, like, I could go on and on. There's so many of these things, and they all are part of this fundamentally, as Claudia called out quite rightly, this fundamentally different idea of who people are. People are not. Sometimes the way I put it is that we live today in what I would call a consumer democracy, where the agency of the individual is limited to choosing between the options that are put to them every few years or months sometimes, but limited to choosing between options someone else has set, just as if you were purchasing in a store. And we're actually conditioned to make those choices on the basis of individual self-interest. Those are the two kind of, like, the we're just seeing today in the UK, the Labour talking about the how much better off or worse off you would be. It's like, as an individual, and it's not. And citizen democracy is about saying, like, what is it for people to actually be involved in the decisions that shape their lives on an ongoing basis, and it brings you back to an understanding of politics that says it's not. It's almost like the Clinton era thing of it's the economy stupid needs to have the word economy crossed out and the word power written instead. Like, it's the power stupid. It's like, who has power to shape the decisions that shape their lives? Is the assumption in our politics that we are lazy, narrowly self-interested individuals who need to be served, or is the assumption in our politics that we're creative, collaborative, caring creatures whose contribution needs to be sought and unleashed? And it's a fundamentally different frame at that level.
Could I just pick up on something, because you kind of touched on this government innovation and social innovation, and I think, there might be some people that are listening that are thinking, well, customer-centrism is just kind of an innovative practice in government, and actually that's really improving services and how people are treated. So how does that kind of connect with the citizen story, and is there a risk of derailing any of that work by switching to a citizen narrative?
I think this is where the fact that I talk about subject, consumer, and citizen, not just consumer and citizen juxtaposed, might be a helpful thing to draw on. Like, so many of the institutions of government and the institutions of our society, particularly in Britain, have quite strong roots in what I would call the subject story. This idea that, essentially the bargain of the subject story is kind of protection in return for obedience, right? Like, it's a paternalism. And breaking out of that story in many places has, like, the consumer story was a good shift relative to the subject story. Like, sometimes in the book I tell the story of my mum had their first washing machine in her family was called a Hot Point Liberator, right? Like, and this stuff that is what's going on when you think about GDS, for example, in the way that developed. But this is another shift on, right? Like, and actually, while those things and the idea of sort of better user experience are not bad things, this is about saying, like, but what is it that we're inviting from people? We're not just trying to deliver for them, we're trying to involve them and excite them. If anyone hasn't, like, the session, the recording you should watch immediately after you watch this one is I interviewed Audrey Tang, the Taiwanese Minister for Digital and Social Innovation, yesterday at a big conference, and just the number of stories they tell about how this idea, like, if you really are user-centric, what you'll realize is that users aren't users, they're humans, they're like I say, creative creatures, and so it can build out of that approach, and it's an evolution on from that approach. It's a sort of yes and to this work, I think, and those who sort of get defensive against it, I think, are mistaking it for a return, for some sort of rejection and an idea of returning to a subject story, but we need to be better and smarter than seeing things as binary polarities.
Yeah. And I guess it kind of takes us to, I just want to touch on the context that we're in right now, in that we've got war in Ukraine, we've got mis and disinformation spreading around the world, and you'd be forgiven for some people listening and wanting to protect what we have in democracy. So, Claudia, I just would love to get your perspective of why now? Like, why do we need to bring this change when we're seeing such a threat to the democracy that we're familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question and a good point, and I can understand why there's that sense of we need to protect what we have, and we certainly do need to protect the fundamentals of what we have. I think that Jon's way of saying yes and applies to this question as well, because it's like, of course, we need to be defending fundamental liberties and freedoms and the things that are foundational to the democracies that we live in. But at the same time, we also need to be conscious and acknowledge the context that we're in, where a majority of citizens in most countries today are disillusioned with the system, the way it works, don't feel like they have a voice, don't feel like they have power, don't feel like they have agency to be genuinely shaping their decisions. I could be citing all sorts of different polling by Edelman and others to do with trust, to do with people feeling like politicians are only in it for themselves, and all sorts of other things. And also worrying trends of more and more people perhaps being open to having just a strongman leader, because clearly just things aren't working. But on the other hand, we could be proposing other ways in which democracy could and perhaps should be evolving, which would tap into this citizen story that we're talking about, which would actually give genuine power to everyday people, but not in some sort of chaotic, like mass, mob rule, mass kind of democracy sort of way, but actually thinking about what are the new institutions that can be creating genuine ways that everyday people could be playing a meaningful role in shaping our decision making. Looking at things like, for example, the permanent Paris Citizens Assembly that was just established here in Paris. And so I was involved in designing this along with FIDE and other experts. And this new institution is something that is now enriching the broader architecture of democracy in this city. It now works alongside the elected city council, but it gives everyday people who are living here, and I say people, not just citizens in that national sense of the word, because it's open to anybody living in Paris to be part of it, not just people who are French citizens. So there's 100 people who are selected by this civic lottery process that I described earlier, who broadly represent Parisians and all of their diversity. They have a 1-year mandate, and actually 4 really serious competencies. So one is that they shape the investment priorities of the city by deciding on the following year's theme for the participatory budget, which concerns 100 million euros, so it's not nothing. They also have an agenda setting role. They decide on what issue should be put to a one-off citizens jury every single year, and that citizens jury will write up its proposals in the form of a local bill that will then be debated and voted on by the elected city council. They're also able to launch an evaluation mission. So an existing public policy in the city, they're able to have it evaluated. How is it working? Put the spotlight on that in a way. And then they also have the same kind of ability as the elected councillors to put current affairs question to the city councillors as well. So bringing up issues which could also be crowdsourced actually from any Parisian and be passed on through this Paris Citizens Assembly. So it's really creating this institution that gives Parisians not just a genuine voice, but actually real influence in shaping decisions that are here. So this is where I mean the sort of yes and, that this is something that's an evolution in our democratic institutions. And what I would be really curious and interested in seeing is, what are the next steps in this? Because that's a really interesting model, but at the same time, at the moment, it's still very much complementary and advisory. So I think we need to see how this works. We need to evaluate it. We need to let it function for a while. But I think that we're also in a context of perhaps needing to think a bit more radically about what other kinds of evolutions do we need to not just create opportunities for voice, but also power.
Can I just add a couple of things? One just to pick up off a the point Claudia was just raising about citizen as a sort of nationalistic construct, and just to touch on that very briefly, I'm very passionate and sort of very passionately argue in the book that we need to reclaim the idea of citizen as language that is about an attitude to the world and a set of behaviors and practices and an identity that is rooted in an attitude to self and other and society, rather than a product or rather than a passport that you own. Like I'd go so far as to say that citizenship as status, as I call it, as opposed to citizenship as practice, is a symptom of the hold of the consumer story. It reduces citizenship to a status you hold or don't, rather than it being a practice that you engage in. I really love, again, to throw people more references, that the Baratunde Thurston in the States has this wonderful podcast called How to Citizen, in which he treats the word citizen as a verb rather than a noun, and that's a lot of the spirit of this thing, I think. The second thing I wanted to say is I would probably go a step further, even in some ways, than what Claudia said. Like I think actually I would argue that the crises that we are in are themselves symptoms of the collapse of this story. Like we're living in a moment of ecological collapse on many fronts, and yet we live in a story that says that material, like the right role for us, that tells us we're consumers constantly, 3,000 times a day through the medium of advertising. In my own background, which is where I started my career, we're living in a time of like massive inequality, and yet the conception of society that the sort of unspoken metaphor of society is the ladder we climb at the expense of one another, that competition over one another is the right thing to do. And like in a time of deep loneliness and isolation, and yet in a story that tells us that we're narrowly defined individuals, like this. And that then manifests on the democratic stage as saying that democracy equals elections or referenda, which creates these moments in time that are so subject to manipulation and sort of messing around with, that precisely because they're not open and dynamic, and that, I think, is itself the problem, right? Like and so only actually by evolving democracy can we save democracy. The existing democracy that we have today is simply not fit for purpose, and so is itself part of the cause of the problems.
Yeah, indeed. And perhaps just to add on that last point, it's also like our democratic institutions have also constantly evolved over the centuries in different ways as well. And we have to remember that most of our democratic institutions today were established during a time where, people literally had to go on horseback to convene, and information traveled at a different pace. And, we didn't have most of the technologies we know today. So it's almost as though like we insisted on continuing to travel by horse and by hot air balloon, because this is, our institutions that we have, stuck to. Whereas actually it's also about how could and should we be adapting our democratic institutions while still safeguarding at their heart the democratic principles that we cherish and we hold dear. So I think that's good about trying to think about those two things together.
One last sentence. I love the way Pia Mancini, who's one of the kind of pioneers of this in Latin America, puts it. It's like democracy in a broadband era can't involve the uploading of 4 kilobytes of data every X months. Like that's just like, how can that be the case?
Could I then touch on this, because we've kind of got to this technology area of how it's the institutions aren't necessarily connected to it, but our democracies are really impacted by technology, and what role do you think technology has to play in this new form of democracy, in this kind of future we're painting together? Maybe Claudia first.
Yeah, for me, technology is obviously an important question and a part of what we need to take into account in any modern day democracy. But it's also, for me, it's almost like the secondary question, though. Like we need to first, I think, prioritize and think about our institutions and how they function. And then we think about what technologies can actually use to support them and to enable inclusiveness and the other democratic principles that we believe in. So I think I think this is maybe more Jon's area of expertise, but if I think just for instance, in the context of deliberative processes, for example, like we have loads of examples of them happening in person. There's also lots that has happened, especially in this past year and a half, 2 years online. But at the end of the day, the principles and the basic premise of how these processes should run is the same, with or without technology. The fact that you have a broadly representative group of people, that, on average, they deliberate for 40 hours, that they work collectively, that they're not just aggregating individual points of view, but actually trying to reach collective public judgment. All of those things, I think, to me, are like the primary aspects of concern when thinking about the future of democracy. But then there's the really important question of how can technology support and enable this? If that makes sense. So it's not like my primary lens of viewing these questions.
Yeah,
I think for me, so I agree with all of that, and I guess I come at the question slightly differently rather than holding a different set of views. I do think. So as I hinted, I think like the citizen story has been in humanity kind of forever and has bubbled up in every moment of crisis and every like. And throughout history, in some ways, I think of like Athens as a bubbling of the citizen story. I think of the Golden Age pirates as a bubbling of the citizen story. But the reason why this moment in time is particularly exciting is because we do have the technologies that would enable it to work at scale. And I think maybe the way I would answer the question is to draw on two Marshall McLuhanisms. So the first one being the medium is the message, right? So in a society dominated by print or whatever, like you get what he meant by that was that the dominant technology of a society, the dominant communications medium of a society, comes to shape the whole of how that society works. So the way I interpret that is in a society dominated by print, that kind of is the subject story, because like there are very few people with the means of communication production, shall we call it, and the rest of us just sort of get told what we get told. In a society dominated by television, you get you get the power to change the channel. You get the power to choose between many different options, but ultimately there's still relatively few people with the sort of means of production of communication. In a society dominated by the internet, it's potentially a many-to-many society, right? Like, and that is the deep potential of the internet as an underlying technology. Then the flip, though, that I would bring is that the second McLuhanism is like, first we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. And this like works in different ways. Like we created the internet and many of the applications on it as consumers and as a marketplace. And one of my sort of, I got very excited, showing my age a bit. I was like quite young and like, yeah, when the sharing economy, as it was then called, sort of first arrived. And I was like, Airbnb's going to save the world. And then it's like, oh no, it's just turned us all into consumers of each other instead of just consumers of businesses. And you're like, and that co-option, Facebook is built out of the consumer mindset, right? And that is the underlying cause of an awful lot of the problems with Facebook. If we can step into a citizen mindset, if we can design social media firms, if we can design social technologies, I'm one of the tools that the Taiwanese government uses a lot is a thing called Polis, which is a wiki survey, which essentially allows anyone, like it's a survey tool, but it allows anyone to propose the statements that are in that survey, and then lets you see who agrees with whom, and in sort of anonymized groupings, and it's basically a consensus building engine to enable citizens to find one another, rather than an echo bubble builder to enable consumers to get pissed off with one another. And like that sort of underlying design philosophy, I think is sort of what Claudia is saying. Like the deeper challenge is who are we designing these things for, and what conception of human nature are we working towards? And that, I think, applies also to this new wave of technologies, Web3. Like, and the irony is like that every wave of technology has greater and greater citizen potential, I think. Like the inbuilt capability in a lot of Web3 for ownership to be distributed is really exciting and powerful and full of potential. But in this moment in time, it's like if we stay in the sort of consumer story, or if we reboot that story, it's perfectly possible that like Dogecoin could become the global reserve currency, and Elon Musk is basically all powerful over us all, right? Like that is and that's arguably the more likely place that Web3 tech is going. Versus and equally the subject story might come back, and like the way China's using an awful lot of these sort of technology, the new wave of technology, actually as weapons of mass surveillance. Like this is all of these potentials are there. So the much deeper question is, who do we think of people as being, and how do we design the processes and institutions that speak to that, and rather than like what technology is going to save us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, indeed. And I think, I mean, just to add briefly, rebounding on some of the things that Jon had said, I think it's also about in what ways can and should we combine technology and not lose in-person things, because even the example of polis being used in Taiwan a lot, it's used in combination with these mass in-person deliberations actually too. So also not always reducing it to just this online thing, because I have to say in my field of work, I get approached quite often by well-intentioned and well-meaning people in government who, you know, want to set up an online platform. And it's like, and why do you want to do it? And it's like, we want a platform. And it's like, well, what is going to be the purpose of this? And it's like, there's a whole other series of questions of what it's used for. And at the moment, I feel like a lot of these online platforms, and even, you know, things that are used quite often like Decidim and other kind of crowdsourcing things, they're designed in a way to just aggregate individual people's views. And to me, that's kind of still within this consumer paradigm, rather than trying to create the spaces for people to work collectively, see where they have common ground. And I still think that it's more important almost than ever today that we create these physical spaces for diverse groups of people to actually spend time together, because for me anyways, and drawing on quite a lot of research around trust, you know, we strengthen it when we spend time with people. So it actually necessitates, you know, time over some sort of period, but also, you know, spending time in person is even more influential for that. So I think the notion of scaling also comes through a lens of seeing an approach to institutionalization, which creates more opportunities for more people to be playing that meaningful role, is like another perspective of how scaling can happen too.
I'm gonna do my one final sentence thing. We're getting into a little rhythm here. I'm really struck. For example, I agree totally. Like face-to-face is invaluable in this, and we can't ignore it. But like just on trust, like I've heard quite often in this sort of Web3 emerging space, people talking about like designing out the need for trust, and you're like, what the actual? And it's really striking when you hear someone like Audrey Tang, in Taiwan talking, and some of the stuff that the Taiwanese have done is actually very lo-fi, like a phone line which connects you during the pandemic, which enabled any citizen to ring up with an idea for how the country's response could be better and get connected to someone in government somewhere who had all been trained, like person to person. And what I said to Audrey when I interviewed her for the book was people in Taiwan must really trust the government for this stuff to be possible. And the response was, trust is essential, but it's not about people trusting the government. It's about government trusting the people. And that, I think, is like designers who are building technologies and trying to design out trust are fundamentally expressing a lack of belief and faith in humanity. And the challenge to them, just as the challenge to government, is what if you believed in people and you saw that the role you had as a technology builder and designer as being to unleash human potential rather than to design out basic human nastiness. Like, and that's the level at which, that's the sort of philosophical level at which we have to be working in this moment in time.
I fully agree.
I think great. I think we've kind of picked up on a few of those points there, and it's convinced me at least that, you know, we're moving from voice to power, institutions trusting citizens, not the other way around. I want to do a really quick fire round for anyone in the audience that's still a little bit skeptical. So, you know, often as practitioners, we face some resistance in introducing these sort of methods. So I'm going to play the citizen skeptic for you guys, and we want short, snappy answers to questions that, you know, us practitioners receive a lot. So, you know, if I had a boxing ring with me, I would be ringing it.
You would be dinging the bell.
Exactly. So starting with you, Jon, are people really clever enough to be given power, and won't they make the wrong decisions?
Look how nervous he is about asking these questions.
Can't be taken out of context.
I mean, the short answer is yes. I think that the slightly longer answer would be the part of this is about recognizing many different types of expertise, the expertise of experience, the expertise that comes of being close to the ground in an issue, the expertise of specifics as opposed to the expertise of generalities. And the key point of a lot of this work is that it's not about one or the other, it's about all of us are smarter than any of us and bringing those together. The second point I would make is in the framing of like when they make the wrong decisions. There are also many different phases of a decision. It's not necessarily that this is all about like decide. It's about like where do the ideas come from, where does the sense, as Claudia talked to in the Paris system, but also in the Reykjavik thing, where does the agenda setting come from? So this and where do the input, where do the ideas at the beginning of a process and the recommendations, and like it's not just about like make a decision. So those two things, I think.
Great. And Claudia, so if by chance citizens get it right, you know, wouldn't they probably reach the same decision as the experts would make anyway?
I feel like I want to challenge the premise of the framing of that question, but I'm going to just answer it and probably touch on some of it in doing so, because I think, first of all, the issues that we face as a society are not just technical. You know, they're about values, they're about morals and ethics and how we want to just live together as a society. So this is why most problems don't actually have a right answer. So the notion of if by chance they get it right, you know, it's up to us to decide actually what is right. And, you know, I want to acknowledge the fact that, of course, expertise and evidence needs to inform our decision making, and it plays a super, super crucial role. But it's ultimately just one ingredient in a deliberation where we have to have a conversation also about our values and our priorities. And I suppose touching into, you know, the notion of collective intelligence from the center that you work in, there's also on top of that a huge amount of research from different fields which shows that having a diverse group of people tends to lead to better decision making than a more homogeneous group, including groups of experts. So I think you can tackle that question from numerous perspectives.
Thank you. And Jon, do people really want to get involved in tackling the challenges we face? Wouldn't they prefer experts, business owners, politicians to make decisions for them?
I feel like batting this one to Claudia for the stat to really kill it. But my very short answer would be, especially in the UK, it's not that long ago that the line "take back control" was very, very powerful in this country. So and that was speaking to a very deep hunger and need. Claudia, you told me a while ago about that stat about those who were most appealed to by populist politics.
This was thinking about the research I did for my first book, The Populist Signal, in 2014, where I did polling in the UK in particular, looking at, you know, who would be most open to participating in a citizens' assembly, and it was people voting for populist parties who were the most keen and wanting to get involved, which I admit actually went against my hypothesis, because it goes against this dominant narrative that we have of like why people are voting for populists and other things. But to me, it actually shows that when we create the conditions for much more positive and constructive forms of being able to participate and contribute, that people are more than willing to do it. And we also have the evidence now from hundreds of examples that people are more than willing to get involved and to play a civic role, even if they maybe haven't voted or haven't been part of a party or done other political things beforehand too.
It's like I said before, it's like that if the politics of the 1990s had the line "it's the economy stupid," the politics of the 2020s need to get with the line "it's the power stupid."
I'm going to turn to a question from the audience now, just before we do a bit of reflection on Nesta from you guys. But this from Tim Curtis. So at a smaller and less well-funded scale, how do citizen assemblies ensure that all of the people groups in a given locality are given voice rather than being captured by the most active high social capital groups and individuals? Claudia,
yes,
might be...
Yeah, maybe I'll take this one on, and for this, it's to say two things. One is that the civic lottery process that I described, where in the first instance you invite a very large number of people to be part of this, means that you're reaching the people who are not highly active, who maybe have never voted, who've never gone to a town hall meeting, who aren't part of political parties. But by receiving a letter that's from someone who is who has an authority to be able actually to do something on the back of this whole process taking place. So a mayor or a minister or someone like this, it taps into a sense of, okay, this is actually important. There's also a civic duty that I'm being called on to be part of this. And it also brings in the people who don't typically participate. And then also the stratification means that you're controlling for that broader group to actually be reflective of the diversity of society. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for the more active people who are part of civil society or organizations and other things, because I don't want this to come across in any way to suggest that that's not important and that those groups shouldn't have a voice either. But within these processes, they are part of the stakeholders. Because they have a certain form of expertise and evidence to bring on the topic, they really have a role to be playing, but it's just a different role, not directly as part of it.
And Jon, another question we have from the audience was, would you agree with this from Radical Civics? We see citizenship as incorporating a broader array of agents, including underrepresented humans, future generation, and non-humans. I think it kind of touches on that point, is if we become really citizen-centered, are we just focused on the here and now? Are we forgetting future generations, the natural environment?
No, absolutely. And one of the ways I would describe, like, the concept of citizenship that I'm talking about is like a nested concept. Like I'm a citizen of London, I'm a citizen of England, I'm a citizen of Britain, I'm a citizen of Europe, I'm a citizen of the world, I'm a citizen of the biosphere, I'm a citizen of humanity. Like that I think is vital. And I think, but what I'd say is these sorts of processes create the space for you to go into these sorts of approaches and inhabit these kinds of mentalities really powerfully. So I'd point the Radical Civics crew to, and anyone else who's interested, to the work of Phoebe Tickell is one who talks about moral imaginations and creates some really fascinating processes to inhabit the idea of seeing things from a seventh generation perspective, for example, within that can be brought into, if you create the quality of time and space that Claudia has talked about at length into some of these processes, then you actually have an opportunity to do that. And the last thing I'll say is, like, again, this points to the idea of acupuncture points and many different ways to approach. But I think the Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations is a really good example of a citizen-focused democracy, actually.
Excellent. So I just want to turn our attention quickly inwards, or to me, at Nesta. So I introduced at the beginning that Nesta is now a mission-led organization, and we're seeing that across a lot of the public space. So our missions are to build a sustainable future through reducing household carbon emissions, shaping a fairer start for all, and drive more healthy lives lived in the UK. So as this is becoming a pretty hot topic around the world, I just wanted you guys to kind of reflect on our missions, perhaps, and what do you think Nesta and other mission-focused organizations should be doing when driving towards mission outcomes, and where does citizen participation and agency sit alongside this? I don't know who would like to kick us off.
Go on, Claudia.
Okay, I'm happy to, and then I'll pass it on to you, Jon. But I mean, I suppose, one reflection is, I think that there has been a general trend towards this like mission-focused approach, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but I think, and I don't want to be directly critical of Nesta here, because it's also coming from some sense of ignorance of how these missions were defined. But one general reflection I would have is that I think that what I've noticed is that quite often citizens are engaged at a much later stage. So there's a more top-down approach to defining what is the mission in the first place, which then has an impact on, first of all, what problems get identified, how they're framed, what language is used to describe them, which I think may or may not actually resonate or be in line with the way that citizens would, in terms of like what would be their priority missions and how would they define them. So perhaps just one reflection to kick things off, and I pass it to Jon, and then we can open up to other things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think what I bring is that idea of, if you start from the conception of humans as creative, caring, collaborative creatures who actually need to shape the society they're in as a pretty deep need, then I think you look at those 3 missions and like, cool. I mean, again, as Claudia sort of hints, like, is there, if you're a mission-focused organization, how do you involve citizens, like and you have a kind of national or global remit? How do you work with people to set those and decide which is a really interesting first question. I think with it, once you have them, there's something about like, what's the conception of humanity that sits at the heart of them, and what's the understanding of what they mean as a result as well, and as well as a process question, which is sort of what's coming throughout this conversation, I think. So take sustainable future, like focus on individual household carbon emissions. I worry a bit about that, because the suggestion is that focuses you on individual behavior change, which is in a kind of 1 + 1 + 1 theory of how emissions are reduced, and takes you actually into a space of like, how do you get people to, again, I'm speaking from a position of slight ignorance, but it's like, actually I would argue that people coming together, well, give you one really clear example. The Climate Assembly came out with a recommendation of a frequent flyer levy, right? And like, that is a really powerful intervention, far more powerful than any given individual. Not that I'm saying it isn't important for any given individual to take one fewer flight or whatever, but it's when we come together as citizens, and an agency like Nesta is having the power and voice to actually hold some of these things. I think playing with that kind of agency feels really important. How do we want the parameters for our nation to be set, rather than what can we do? How do we nudge individual behavior change? On Fairer Start, for example, just to apply the same kind of logic, I was thinking about this the other. It's like, well, what if what we're saying is that if people are citizens, how are the opportunities for voice and actual meaningful agency encouraged earlier? David Runciman, the Cambridge philosopher, has been writing recently about votes at 6. That's a really interesting element. I mean, not that voting is the whole thing, but just as like an example of where that might take you. And health, I guess, is the one that I stare at most. And I'm like, if you understand and you really look at the stuff on this, people having a sense of meaningful agency, which I would define as power commensurate with the scale of the challenge, not just able to do something. People who have a sense of purpose, people who have power, people who have self-efficacy, people who have political efficacy, live longer, are healthier, are happier, like that. And so there's a risk that those sorts of ideas don't come in if the underlying conception isn't sort of opened and challenged. And I'm not saying it's not, but it's sort of, that's the sort of thing, I think. So both at a philosophical level, like, how do we understand what we're trying to do with humanity, what's our understanding of humanity that you base these missions on, and at a process level, how do you define the missions, how do you choose missions, how do you define missions once they're chosen, how do you understand the work you want to do by doing it with people, not for them, is really critical, both aspects of that.
Yeah. And it makes me think just on one area, perhaps you were touching on, Claudia, in terms of like, what's the mission areas that citizens would choose, and isn't there a part of this that, first of all, that we know the problems, climate change, health inequality, etc. Isn't it okay to kind of start at those points? And then on the second part of where you both touched on this is this idea of impact, and social innovation is really impact driven, and I just wonder what the kind of change on impact is when we become more citizen led.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose to some extent, yes, we do know what the problems are and the challenges are, but it's also about how we actually frame those problems and challenges, and which ones we prioritize as well, which I think I'm not sure that actually always ends up lining up between kind of more experts who are working on things and the way that people would see them as well. And it's been interesting to see actually in the places where agenda setting has become part of the roles of citizens' assemblies. So it's happening here in Paris, in Ostbelgien, in Brussels, and the sorts of issues that citizens are bringing up are, also real challenges and problems. So in Ostbelgien, which is the German-speaking community of Belgium, it's the world's first place where they institutionalized an agenda-setting citizens' council, where they brought together a randomly selected representative group of people. The very first challenge that they wanted to focus on pre-COVID is, how can we improve the working conditions of people working in healthcare in our region? It's not so it's not to say that it was obvious that this was going to be the very first thing that they brought up, and actually, given that we then went into a pandemic, this seemed like actually citizens were really quite preemptive and thoughtful, and quite right to be choosing an issue like that to be bringing up to the top of our priorities. So I suppose it's like, of course, like we have a general sense of our challenges today, but I think we're seeing that it's not always the same issues, and they're not always framed the same way when they're brought up by people.
And if I pick up on the impact part of that question, maybe because I'm with all of that, I think the idea of, I've mentioned already the concept of a citizen confidence index, like, right, and the idea of like measures of agency and efficacy, and understanding like that those things they may be subjective, but or the measures of them may be subjective, but they're incredibly valid, and respecting those kinds of things, and not reducing, not immediately trying to go. I mean, it's obvious, right? Like, it's the whole kind of what you measure, you maximize, and if you just choose to measure the things that you can measure, then you miss out on whole loads of stuff. Like, but the encouragement here is to understand. The encouragement from thinking of people as citizens is to understand how critical agency, voice, power are in any kind of human outcome, and to build that into impact measurement, I think. And I guess I'm conscious of time, and sort of maybe I'll offer my kind of closing thoughts to this. I think it's really, and I don't mean to come across critical, like I've long loved and admired Nesta, and I continue to do so. I think but it is really helpful to hold up a real organization to some of this thinking and go, like, tangibly, what does this mean? So thank you for asking those questions and offering the opportunity. I think, like, that ultimately for me, this work all comes back to what Claudia reminded me of rather than I put into the room, which is the idea that, like, people are fundamentally capable and fundamentally want to and even need to shape the conditions that shape their lives. And when they are deprived of that opportunity, it's then that the bad stuff starts to happen. QAnon even is an organization that has basically catered to people's need for agency and participation by offering a sense of meaningful contribution where it's being denied by all of the institutions of society. And I think that's the sort of right at the heart of this for me.
Yeah. And Claudia, I guess to wrap us up as well, do you have any kind of closing comments or thoughts for people who are either citizens or in institutions of what they can kind of take away from this?
Yeah, no, I'm conscious we're at the end, so I will keep this brief, and perhaps just take it as a moment to reiterate what we were saying at the beginning, and to really stress what Jon was saying, that a belief in kind of a new kind of democracy, or an evolution in our democracy as we think of it today, really rests at its heart on a belief in that capability and worthiness of everybody to play a meaningful role in actually decision making. So that means a transfer of power, and thinking about what are the ways in which we are not just creating opportunities for voice, because I think that's been kind of the dominant approach actually in this broader field of democratic innovation, and what are the ways in which we could actually be creating genuine opportunities for people to be shaping their lives and actually have decision-making authority as well, which I think will then open up all sorts of important and interesting questions around what does that mean for legitimacy and accountability and sorts of things. But at least giving ourselves the opportunity to explore that, and thinking about how we can be building new institutions and not just setting up one-off processes or things that are happening, is the main thing I would hope people take away from some of the things we've talked about today.
Great. Well, thank you. It's a good provocation to end on, and thank you both for your time. Thank you everyone who's joined us. I think this is kind of testing and stretching our thinking, but also thanks for all your incredible work that you're putting out into the world. So yeah, I'll recommend Jon's book, Citizens, and Claudia's work. It's really fundamental to this whole world.
Copy of my report here.
PDF. Yes, and you can find out more on the OECD's Innovative Citizen Participation website. If you want to find out what we're up to in this space, search for Centre for Collective Intelligence Design, Nesta, and Cold Digit for our Democratic Innovation Research Project. But thank you, and look forward to speaking next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ollie. Bye, John. Thanks, everyone.